He was never meant to see it. The meeting across town had been postponed at the last minute, and instead of wasting hours alone in his office, he drove home through streets washed in pale evening light, his mind heavy with unfinished thoughts and the familiar ache of returning to a house that no longer felt whole. Since his wife's death, every early return had carried a quiet dread. The silence inside those walls often felt louder than noise, filled with memories of her laughter, her piano playing, her gentle encouragement as she guided their two disabled children through exercises and small victories. He unlocked the front door as softly as possible, expecting the usual stillness, perhaps the faint hum of the television left on for comfort. Instead, he heard something else, a fragile melody drifting down the hallway, hesitant but alive. It stopped him mid-step. The notes were uneven, as if played by uncertain fingers, but there was persistence in them, a determination that tightened his chest. Drawn forward, he moved quietly toward the living room, careful not to announce himself. The scene before him froze him in place. The lights were dimmed, casting a warm glow across the carpet where the maid sat cross-legged between his children. She had pulled a small keyboard from the corner of the room, one that had not been touched since his wife passed away. His son, whose motor control was limited and whose hands often trembled, had the keyboard balanced carefully on his lap. The maid's hands were gently wrapped around his, steadying them, guiding one finger at a time toward the keys. "Slowly," she whispered, her voice soft but confident. "Feel the sound before you press." His daughter, confined to her wheelchair, watched with bright, focused eyes. When the boy pressed a key and a clear note rang out, the maid smiled as though he had performed on a grand stage. She didn't clap loudly or make a spectacle of it. She simply nodded with pride, letting him absorb the success. Then she turned to the girl. With tender care, she moved the wheelchair slightly, encouraging her to lift her arms in rhythm to the next notes. "Like a dance," she murmured. "Let the music carry you." The widower felt something unfamiliar stir inside him. Not sorrow, not guilt, but warmth. He had been so consumed with medical appointments, structured therapies, and the fear of failing his children that he had overlooked something essential. They needed moments of lightness. The maid wasn't following any official rehabilitation program. There were no charts, no timers, no rigid instructions. There was only patience. When his son's hand slipped and struck the wrong note, she didn't correct him sharply. She laughed softly and said, "That one sounded adventurous. Let's try again." His daughter giggled at the word, her shoulders shaking with effort and joy. The room, once associated with loss, now pulsed gently with life. The widower stayed hidden in the hallway, afraid that stepping forward might break the fragile magic unfolding before him. He noticed the way the maid adjusted the boy's posture, how she encouraged his breathing before each attempt, how she celebrated not perfection but effort. It was an unexpected gesture, far beyond dusting shelves or preparing meals. She was giving them confidence. She was giving them dignity. And in doing so, she was quietly stitching together the torn edges of a family that had been surviving rather than living. As another hesitant melody filled the air, he realized that for the first time in 2 years, the sound of music in his home did not bring pain. It brought hope. When the floorboard finally creaked beneath his weight, the fragile melody faltered, and the maid looked up in sudden alarm, her hands instinctively pulling back as if she had been caught doing something forbidden. She rose quickly to her feet, smoothing her apron, her face flushed with worry. "Sir, I'm sorry," she began, her voice unsteady. "I finished the cleaning early and they seemed restless, so I thought maybe the music would help. I didn't mean to overstep." For a brief second, he simply stood there, taking in the sight of his children. His son's fingers still hovering over the keyboard as if afraid to lose the courage he had just found. His daughter's cheeks glowing from exertion and excitement. He realized he had not seen that particular brightness in their expressions for a very long time. The tightness in his chest shifted, not into anger, but into something softer, something almost unbearable in its tenderness. "Overstep?" he repeated quietly, stepping further into the room. His voice carried none of the authority she feared. Instead, It trembled with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "You brought music back into this house." The maid blinked, unsure how to respond, while his children turned toward him with eager eyes. "Papa, listen," his son said, his speech slightly strained but filled with pride. Carefully, determined not to let the moment disappear, the boy pressed 3 keys in sequence. The notes were imperfect, spaced unevenly, but they formed the beginning of a melody his wife used to hum on quiet evenings. The sound pierced through him, not as a blade of grief, but as a thread connecting past and present. He sank slowly to his knees beside them, his expensive jacket wrinkling against the carpet, no longer caring about appearances or control. For so long, he had tried to be strong in the most rigid sense, efficient, organized, emotionally restrained. He had believed that protecting his children meant shielding them from reminders of their mother, from anything that might reopen wounds. Yet here they were, smiling through music that carried her memory gently instead of painfully. The maid crouched again, encouraged by his silence rather than rebuke, guiding his daughter's arms in soft, flowing movements. "Feel the rhythm," she whispered again, and the girl laughed as her father awkwardly attempted to tap along with them. He missed every beat, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the room filled with shared laughter instead of polite quiet. Tears slipped down his face openly now, but he did not hide them. They were not tears of defeat. They were the release of a man who had carried too much alone. "Thank you," he finally said, turning to the maid with sincerity that startled her. "I thought I was doing everything right. Doctors, therapy sessions, specialists. But I forgot to give them this." He gestured toward the keyboard, toward the smiles, toward the invisible warmth wrapping around them all. The maid lowered her eyes modestly. "They don't need perfection," she replied softly. "They need moments." Her words settled deeply within him. Moments, not schedules, not fear, not constant reminders of limitation. In that softly lit living room, he understood that rehabilitation was not only about muscles and mobility, it was about spirit. As the music resumed, he placed his hand gently over his son's, steady but not controlling, supportive but not restrictive. His daughter leaned her head against his arm, her breathing calm and content. The house no longer felt like a museum of memories. It felt alive again, imperfect and hopeful. In witnessing an unexpected gesture of simple humanity, he rediscovered something he had nearly lost: the courage to let love, in all its quiet forms, guide them forward.